Chapter 3 The tutor went back to his old life and his old ways, and did his best to forget the strange and horrible interlude of the White House. He gathered his podgy pups once more about him, crammed and coached, read with undergraduates during the long vacation, and was moderately satisfied with the course of things in general. Now and then, when he was endeavoring to persuade the podges against their deliberate judgment that Latin and Greek were languages once spoken by human beings, not senseless enigmas invented by demons, he would think with a sigh of regret of the boy who understood and longed to understand. And he wondered whether he had not been a coward to leave that enchanting child to the evil mercies of his hideous parents. But what could he have done? But it was dreadful to think of Henry, slowly or swiftly corrupted by his detestable father and mother, growing up with the fat slime of their abominations upon him. He went into no detail with his old friends. He hinted that there had been grave unpleasantness which made it impossible for him to remain in the West. They nodded, and perceiving that the subject was a sore one, asked no questions, and talked of old books and the new steak instead. They all agreed, in fact, that the steak was far too new, and William was summoned to explain this horror. Didn't he know that beefsteak meant for the consumption of Christian men, as distinguished from Hottentots, required hanging just as much as game? William, the ponderous and benignant, tasted and tested and agreed, with sorrowful regret. He apologized, and went on to say that, as the gentleman would not care to wait for a fowl, he would suggest a very special, tender, and juicy fillet of roast veal, then in cut. The suggestion was accepted, and found excellent. The conversation turned to choric meters and Florence St. John at the Strand. There was port later. It was many years afterwards, when this old life, after crumbling for a long while, had come down with a final crash, that last heard the real story of his tutorial engagement at the White House. 3 dreadful people were put in the dock at the Old Bailey. There was an old man with the look of a deadly snake, a fat, sloppy, deplorable woman with pendulous cheeks and a faint hint of perished beauty in her eyes, and, to the utter blank amazement of those who did not know the story, a wonderful little boy. The people who saw them in court said he might have been taken for a child of 9 or 10, no more. But the evidence that was given showed that he must be between 50 and 60 at the least, perhaps more than that. The indictment charged these 3 people with an unspeakable and hideous crime. They were charged under the name of Meli, the name which had been borne at the time of their arrest. But it turned out at the end of the trial that they had been known by many names in the course of their career: Meli, De Pass, Lardigan, Delarue, Falcon, Lacosic, Hammond, Marsh, Herringworth. It was established that the apparent boy, whom last had known as Henry Marsh, was no relation of any kind to the elder prisoners. Henry's origins were deeply obscure. It was conjectured that he was the illegitimate son of a very high Englishman, a diplomatist, whose influence had counted for a great deal in the Far East. Nobody knew anything about the mother. The boy showed brilliant promise from the very early years, and the father, a bachelor, and disliking what little he knew of his relations, left his very large fortune to his son. The diplomatist died when the boy was 12 years old, and he had been aged, and more than aged, when the child was born. People remarked that Arthur Wesley, as he was then called, was very short for his years, and he remained short, and his face remained that of a boy 7 or 8. He could not be sent to a school, so he was privately educated. When he was of age, the trustees had the extraordinary experience of placing a very considerable property in the hands of a young man who looked like a little boy. Very soon afterwards, Arthur Wesley disappeared. Dubious rumors spoke of reappearances, now here, now there, in all quarters of the world. There were tales that he had gone Fantee, in what was then unknown Africa, when the mountains of the moon still lingered on the older maps. It was reported again that he had gone exploring in the higher waters of the Amazon, and had never come back. But a few years later, a personage that must have been Arthur Wesley was displaying unpleasant activities in Macau. It was soon after this period, according to the prosecution, that, in the words of counsel, he realized the necessity of taking cover. His extraordinary personality, naturally enough, drew attention to him and his doings, and these doings, being generally or always of an infamous kind, such attention was both inconvenient and dangerous. Somewhere in the East, and in very bad company, he came upon the two people who were charged with him. Arabella Manning, who was said to have respectable connections in Wiltshire, had gone out to the East as a governess, but had soon found other occupations. Mears had been a clerk in a house of business at Shanghai. His very ingenious system of fraud obtained his discharge, but, for some reason or other, the firm refused to prosecute, and Mears went, where Arthur Wesley found him. Wesley thought of his great plan. Manning and Mears were to pretend to be Mr. and Mrs. Marsh. That seemed to have been their original style, and he was to be their little boy. He paid them well for their various services. Arabella was his mistress-in-chief, the companion of his milder moments for some years. Occasionally, a tutor was engaged to make the situation more plausible. In this state, the horrible trio peregrinated over the earth. The court heard all this, and much more, after the jury had found the three prisoners guilty of the particular offense with which they were charged. This last crime, which the press had to unfold in periphrase and periphrase, had been discovered, strange as it seemed, largely as a result of the woman's jealousy. Wesley's affections, let us call them, were still apt to wander, and Arabella's jealous rage drove her beyond all caution and all control. She was the weak joint in Wesley's armor, the rent in his cover. People in court looked at the two, the debauched, deplorable woman with her flagging, sagging cheeks, and the dim fire still burning in her wary old eyes, and at Wesley, still, to all appearance, a bright and handsome little boy. They gasped with amazement at the grotesque, impossible horror of the scene. The judge raised his head from his notes and gazed steadily at the convicted persons for some moments. His lips were tightly compressed. The detective drew to the end of his portentous history. The track of these people, he said, had been marked by many terrible scandals, but till quite lately there had been no suspicion of their guilt. Two of these cases involved the capital charge, but formal evidence was lacking. He drew to a close. In spite of his diminutive stature and juvenile appearance, the prisoner, Charles Maley, alias Arthur Wesley, made a desperate resistance to his arrest. He is possessed of immense strength for his size, and almost choked one of the officers who arrested him. The formulas of the court were uttered. The judge, without a word of comment, sentenced Maley, or Wesley, to imprisonment for life, John Mears to 15 years imprisonment, Arabella Manning to 10 years imprisonment. The old world, it has been noted, had crashed down. Many, many years had passed since last had been hunted out of Mowbray Street, that went down dingily, peacefully, from the Strand. Mowbray Street was now all blazing office buildings. Later, he had been driven out from one nook and corner and snug retreat after another, as New London rose in majesty and splendor. But for a year or more he had lain hidden in a by-street that had the advantage of leading into a disused graveyard near the Gray's Inn Road. Medwin and Garraway were dead, but last summoned the surviving Zouch and Noel to his abode one night, and then and there made punch, and good punch, for them. "It's so jolly it must be sinful," he said, as he pared his lemons, "but up to the present I believe it is not illegal, and I still have a few bottles of that port I bought in '92. And then he told them for the first time all the whole story of his engagement at the White House.